Waterbury during World War II, its contribution and citizens. Filmed on location in Waterbury, Connecticut. Waterbury, nicknamed the Brass City, is a city in the U.S. state of Connecticut on the Naugatuck River, 33 miles southwest of Hartford and 77 miles northeast of New York City. Waterbury was put on the map during World War II because of its huge economic contribution and large population. It has a rich history and served well throughout World War II. They had three major metal workers in the Brass City, which were Scoville Manufacturers, Chase Brass and Copper, and American Brass. Waterbury was a big business center in the early 1940s. They had big-name corporations running their offices through this New England city. The Big Three Metalworks, as mentioned before, but also Waterbury Clock, which is now Timex, was run in Waterbury. No matter what time of the day, there was always someone walking up and down the street who worked in this section because of all the business. They were always open. This section flourished during the war because these companies were used a lot by the U.S. government to make supplies for weapons, aircraft, vehicles, and uniforms for all the soldiers in every branch. Because of these huge corporations choosing Waterbury as their home, the citizens of Waterbury had no trouble finding a job and making money. As shown here on East Main Street, everyone could go out and enjoy spending a little money for themselves. One of the big three was Scoville Manufacturers. Its original headquarters was on South Main Street, across from where Jejur's Market is located today. Scoville Manufacturing was one of the big three in Waterbury in the time because they had gotten a lot of business from the government during the war. They had been used in the First World War and were always making things for the government on the side, such as buttons and buckles for army uniforms. During the war, they made things for the government, such as buttons and buckles as before. Then they turned all their production into war supplies, like these bullets here. This first one is for an assault shotgun. This next one is for a .85 caliber rifle. And this last one for a .75 caliber rifle. They had a lot of land in Waterbury, some 90 acres. They employed many women and teens to help with the war aid. Here are some shots of the different buildings on their land that were used to make supplies. These buildings were all left standing after the company's closing in the years following the war. They were taken down recently in the 90s by the city because they had been left unmaintained for many years and were becoming dangerous because of their decay. The other two members of the Big Three in Waterbury were Waterbury Brass and Chase Brass and Copper. These two were also under the contract of the government to make things like buttons and bullets for the war. One thing that Chase Brass and Copper did that the other two didn't was that it was used to make components for the atomic bombs used in Japan. Now, even though these three played a huge part in Waterbury and Connecticut's contribution to the war efforts, there were still many other companies that helped in many ways. One city that was helpful in the war was Naugatuck, and a company within the city was the Naugatuck Rubber Factory. They produced many rubber supplies for the war and for the soldiers' supplies on their guns and whatnot. Another company in Waterbury was Lux Clock. They also helped by making little things for the war in their factories during this time. These are all some of the companies that helped leave their stamp on history.
My father-in-law was an immigrant from Germany, and he got sponsored by an aunt and uncle that lived in the United States. And he got a job at Lux Clock, where he worked there 45 years. And my mother-in-law, when she was younger, worked for the Naugatuck Rubber Shop. And then later on, she put in about almost 30 years in Lux Clock herself.
Another way Waterbury helped through the war was with buying war bonds. The people who had jobs in the factories and children at home bought over $270 million worth of war bonds. They also helped by collecting 68,000 pounds of scrap rubber, over 5 million pounds of scrap metal, over 8 million pounds of paper, and over 150 tons of waste fat. One major contribution Waterbury had throughout the war was the soldiers fighting, the nurses helping the wounded. Waterbury had a total of 99,313 people in the year 1940. Of the 99,000 people, 12,000 men and 500 women served in the armed forces. Of the 12,500 who helped on the front lines, 282 lost their lives fighting for their country. In the state of Connecticut, 4,347 men and women lost their lives in combat. Out of that number, 282 were from the city of Waterbury. Waterbury had many citizens who were soldiers in this war. They had people serving in every branch, ranging from the Air Force to the Marines to the Army. They had men and women serving on both fronts, in Europe and the Pacific on the island hopping campaign. Even though there were only a few number of people who fought from this city, they all had an impact. One of the soldiers who served in the Army and was on the Pacific front was Mr. Joe Cara.